Hello, everybody, and welcome to Some Patches Required, a show where we seek to educate and hopefully entertain all of you wonderful folks on the ever-turbulent games industry. I'm one of your hosts, Zach.
And I am the other host, Aaron.
And before we dive into the meat and potatoes, as we like to say, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to all of the returning listeners, and of course, a thank you to all of the new listeners as well. We love and appreciate all of you. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and recommend us, though, to any friends, family, or just anybody that you think would generally like this show. We really appreciate it, and it helps us grow. So, yeah.
Yeah, anything you can do to help us get a little bit of a boost, that would be tremendously helpful, and we appreciate every single one of you who does so, whether that just be listen, share, whatever, everything Zach said, no stress. Outside of that, now that we've got the paperwork out of the way, what are we talking about?
We're going to be talking about sequels today because for those that somehow don't know, Zelda Tears of a Kingdom came out, I believe, at this point about a week ago. Now, obviously,
wait, it's not Tears of the Kingdom?
It is not Tears of the Kingdom. I do know that English is a confusing language.
Kingdom?
No, it's the same reason that live and live are different.
No, this is true. No, I accidentally. This is a completely true story. And this will be very brief. I did accidentally tell somebody. I was like, "Did you hear people telling other people that it might have been Tears of the Kingdom?" Can you imagine being that that dumb? And they were like, "I thought it was Tears of the Kingdom," and then I shrank into the floor, and disappeared.
What if it's been Tears of a Kingdom this whole time and the majority of people are just idiots and thought it was Tears?
I'm pretty sure Nintendo confirmed it was Tears.
Oh, it wasn't obvious enough that they had to confirm what it was.
Yes, this is true. This is true. This was now like 6 months ago or something like that. But yes, Tears of the Kingdom is out, and it is certainly a game.
It is certainly a game. What I do want to say before we dive into more of the subject, there was a lot of candidly kind of concerning content with Tears of the Kingdom, Aaron. I don't know if you noticed all over Twitter and some social media platforms that Koroks were being crucified and tortured in all manner of way. I was told this probably for a solid week, didn't believe people because it never popped up on my social media feed. Then I went to Pocket Gamer for work and started seeing it everywhere. And I was just like, what the hell is wrong with people?
Yeah. What the hell is wrong with people? You give people a creation tool powerful enough to do weird shit, and people will do weird shit. There's just no denying that. And yeah, I actually had heard about that, but it was by proxy through a Kotaku article that I was reading. And yeah, I'm like, please don't do that. So in case you don't know what we're talking about, Tears of the Kingdom is... Well, I know you know what I'm talking about, Zach, but we're talking to the listener now.
I've never even played the game.
I have shifted perspective. Also, real quick, I just want to say for everybody, I am currently cosplaying Link. As we record, I'm wearing my midnight release Zelda right arm sleeve that I was given for showing up at midnight to purchase Tears of the Kingdom, which I did. But Tears of the Kingdom is the sequel to Breath of the Wild, one of the most acclaimed video games, I think, of all time.
Are you sure it's not Birth of the Wild?
It's not Birth of the Wild. It's not Broth of the Wild. It's not Wine of the Rice. I don't know. But yeah, no, it is the sequel to that, and that's one of the most acclaimed video games of all time. Zelda has a track record of doing that. Breath of the Wild, I think, actually beat out Ocarina. It sits at a 97 on Metacritic, and I believe at my last check, Tears of the Kingdom is at a 96 on Metacritic. So it is a huge deal, and it is more or less a direct sequel in so much as any Zelda game can be a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild. And it gives you these insane tools to manipulate objects and just attach them to things. And it kind of revolutionizes the Breath of the Wild formula, which if you haven't played it, you should. I have put a shameful number of hours in there, and I've also put already a shameful number of hours into Tears of the Kingdom and have accomplished very little.
Yeah, what I'll say on a quick note about Tears of the Kingdom is that I played a little bit of Breath of the Wild. I didn't get very far. That's not entirely true. I did beat some of the temple stuff or whatever they were called, the
divine beasts.
Yeah. But what I will say is that I am absolutely enamored with Tears of the Kingdom. I think it's honestly, at least for me, a much better game. I love it. I absolutely love it, and I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that there's a lot of creativity in the features in this game that enable you to. I mean, we just had an episode on player-generated content. I mean, you're not really making player-generated content, but you're definitely making player-generated monstrosities when it comes to the creation features that are in the game. And I'm sure if anyone's looked into Tears of the Kingdom, you've seen some of the goofy contraptions, gadgets, vehicles that people have been able to come up with. And I think it's just incredibly charming, and it gives them a lot of creativity in what they can do with the puzzles in this game, and even some of the like sequences as you like progress through the main story, side quests, etc. I won't elaborate on that for the sake of spoilers. We're gonna probably try to not do too many spoilers, but I'll say spoiler review regardless. But I know I have to be careful because Aaron hasn't done any main story stuff, whereas I'm 3 temples in.
I am the dumpster fire of a human being who's like, I'm gonna unlock all of the Skyview towers and try to get as much of the map filled in as possible before I go exploring. I'm not sure why I'm that way, but I am that way, so I've done very few of the main quests, although I do have 2 full stamina wheels, and a lot of other stuff that I've collected through my travels. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so the game itself, it actually is an interesting thing, and I'll make this brief again. With user-generated content, it's almost a more accurate use of the term user-generated content, because you're not sharing it with other people unless you're recording your feed and streaming it or putting it on YouTube or whatever. You are just making shit. Full stop. What do you want to make? You might be able to make it. I was playing the game about minus 1 minute from when Zach called me so that we could record this podcast, and I was in a shrine on the Great Plateau and had found that there was a regenerating large stone block that I could just attach to both shields and weapons, and just made that for myself. I kind of generated that, and now I just get to have it. And the game lets you do that, and that's the level of flexibility that this game offers. And it's a wild departure from Breath of the Wild, a game which, like I said, I've put a shameful number of hours into. It doesn't feel that much different from Breath of the Wild to me in terms of a couple of bits, but there is an evolution. And I wish I'd pulled this article because I'll never forget the headline. It was a very favorable review, calling it evolution, not revolution. And Breath of the Wild was a revolution in game development, game design, and how to structure an open world, how to trust your players. And this game evolves that and just gives you way more tools to create your own journey. The way you get through it is bonkers.
Yeah.
It's 100% worth playing, and one of the more engaging games I've experienced in a while. And I say that as a person who just finished The Last of Us Part 2 for the third time. It's so flexible that it makes me wonder how they even made it. I read an article about that as well. There was a Paul Tassi article on Forbes. If you're not reading Paul Tassi's stuff, you're missing out on a lot of really good takes on video games. He was like, how is this running on Switch?
It is kind of crazy with how big everything is, and just the amount of environment assets that are everywhere in the game. It is pretty impressive.
And almost all of them have physics.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just chopping down a tree. It's absolutely bonkers that this game is still running on hardware that was outdated when the PS4 came out.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that gets into kind of the larger topic of how do you make a good sequel that's interesting to note at this point is that one of the choices that Tears of the Kingdom made when becoming a sequel is that it does not look that much better, if better at all, than Breath of the Wild.
It's
which
nearly
is
identical except for a color palette switch.
Yeah, basically. And obviously the scale
green.
goes up. And then there's changes with the mechanics and the tools you get. But yeah, like you're saying, outside of some color palette changes, it's really the same art style. So I think that probably helped them when they were moving to Switch. It let them probably work on other aspects of the game and optimization, since they didn't have to deal with the whole art side, I would assume, as much. But what I think is interesting with that is, I don't know that when you're making a sequel, especially a AAA one, I do feel like there's kind of an expectation from audiences that you improve the graphical fidelity, which I'm not saying is a good thing that there is this expectation, but I do think that that's a thing that often kind of comes with the territory.
Yeah, I would agree with that. However, I would say that this brings up like one minimal point and one major point. So the game director on the first God of War has famously tweeted that the Tears of the Kingdom looks bland and old. And
wait, was that Corey?
No, it was not. It was not Cory Barlog.
Okay.
It was the original guy.
Oh, I'm remembering the tweet.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't remember the guy's name, but yeah.
I don't remember the guy's name either, and I feel like a complete dingus for not remembering it. But he famously tweeted recently that the game looks old and bland, basically. And he said, it's not necessarily a big thing. Graphical fidelity is not everything, but it's worth talking about. And I kind of agree, but also I think that Nintendo games and Zelda specifically exist outside of a singular art style. God of War has always gone for heightened realism, whereas Zelda has gone for either here's what we can do because we're working with really limited resources, up to let's find a softened realism. When I was working with the IMI at the VR stuff, when we were trying to find an art style for a simulation, we started looking at the soft realism element of Breath of the Wild and saying, can we emulate that? Can we try and use that to make it feel immersive but not draw too much power from the hardware that any given VR headset can handle at that time? And this would have been 3, 4, 5 years ago. So the visual component of it is fine. The fact that the gameplay loop is almost identical, I think, is fine. It's just the way that the game lets you interact with the world that makes it so much different than Breath of the Wild. I don't think I could pick a favorite between the two. I haven't gone through any of the major dungeons or temples or whatever you want to call them, but I do think that the level of creativity that the game empowers players with will perhaps become, a trend. But, outside of that, I would say if you've got a Switch, pick up Tears of the Kingdom. It is $70. It's the first $70 Switch game. That's kind of a tough pill to swallow since you're technically playing it on last gen software or hardware rather. But it is a cornucopia of delights, many of which you make for yourself.
Yeah, no, I mean that everything you just said, including, I mean I've got my own thoughts on like the $70 game thing. We did a whole episode on it, but regardless, like I think it's a great game. I think people should check it out. But to your earlier point, as it's like fading in my mind, but it's still there. It's just interesting because I think ultimately you benefit from having a non-realistic art style. I'm a big proponent of stylized. I think a lot more games should utilize it. I think you can make some pretty mature content and still be stylized. Well,
they did it to Tarantino.
I mean exactly, but
in Kill Bill.
Well, it just holds up better. And I mean, in that obviously, like there's still real life actors and there's that kind of thing.
Totally.
But when you're talking about like video games, like it's largely why I think like World of Warcraft even is playable at this point is because it never tried to be realistic. But that's not really that's not really a comment necessarily on sequels. But I guess like to expand it out to sequels, if you're looking at anything, so you mentioned like God of War, right? It's an interesting example. If you go between God of War 2018 and then God of War Ragnarok, there is a slight graphical fidelity improvement. There, it's at the point where like when we make improvements these days, I feel like it's so minimal. But there still technically is one. I remember seeing the side to sides before Ragnarok came out. But like, can you imagine how pissy people would get with any of those realistic looking games if the sequel didn't look better? I mean, hell, people make fun of, I think it's like Fallout New Vegas for not looking better than Fallout 4.
No, and it didn't.
Like, it didn't, but like, it's a great game. It's probably my favorite Fallout game, but like,
it's actually my favorite Fallout game.
Yeah, no, it's just, to my earlier point, I feel like there's a big risk there when you don't improve the graphics. And then actually the thing that's kind of related to that is I remember I had commented to you before I got it and we were contemplating doing an episode on sequels. I was like, well, is it just the same map? Which it's not. I won't necessarily elaborate on that, but it's the same map but plus. Yeah, it
doesn't feel like it at all. And they have also they've layered 2 other maps on the map.
Yeah.
It is astronomically large, this world.
Yeah, no, it's huge. So, but they successfully basically like reused the old map, changed it, and then added on to it, and it doesn't feel bad. But like I was kind of saying to you initially, I feel like that'd be a really easy situation for someone to be like, well, this just feels like an expansion, which it doesn't at all to me.
Initially for me, I'll be honest, it did. Very initially, and it was while I was dealing with the Great Sky Islands. The opening segment is the Great Plateau section for those of you who've played Breath of the Wild but haven't played Tears of the Kingdom. The tutorial area feels, it's very similarly structured, but it does funnel you through a lot of the things. You collect all of your powers with the exception of the camera and the now called Purapad. It used to be the Sheikah Slate. Tablet? Now it's the Purapad. Yeah. You get all your powers and you can do all that stuff with the exception of a couple of upgrades to the Purapad. But it's structured similarly. Cool. You get down to Hyrule and it's like, okay, it's Hyrule. Huzzah! I can just go to everywhere that I already knew where things were, and it works. It works really well. And it actually nails one of my bigger complaints with Breath of the Wild, which is that it was supposed to be this post-apocalyptic situation. Like, this calamity happened. Ganon is being held at bay by Zelda's power, and everything's gone to shit. but then you just go into town and there's just like little kids running around and people are like, I'm dancing, this is fun. I'm just sitting by the fire. But the monster problem is terrible. And ever since the calamity, things have gotten so much worse. And then you go to the other city and it's just like little Zora children running around. And it's like, this is kind of a little bit of a narrative dissonance here. In this one, this actually feels like crazy dark. It feels ominous to kind of run around this world. It feels like something bad has happened. And that's just my reviewer brain coming out, but it works for me, in that sense. And again, that's a part of the evolution that is inherent to sequels. And they added a ton of content, and they changed the map, and they gave a narrative reason for the map being changed. And I think that overall, it's just the right level of caution and the right level of ambition to make a good game.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of passion and creativity that went into the experience for sure. And one thing about, keeping it to Zelda, but not necessarily Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. But one thing that I do think's interesting is I don't know how many Zelda games there are if you add them all up, but they're well past the rule of 3. Yeah. Too many. They're well past the rule of 3, which I feel like for me is kind of this standard that if you want to make a trilogy of games, I think that can be really safe. I feel like people have the appetite and you can get a really solid like character growth out of like a 3-stage game, a 3-stage movie, da-di-da-di-da. But I feel like as we've seen with so many things, i.e. Halo, once you get past 3 and you're still dealing with the same character, the same IP, things can get really dry and it can lose what initially made it really kind of impactful. And I know this is something that we kind of like loosely talked about, Aaron, and you played way more Zelda games than I have. I think I played like briefly Ocarina of Time for like the 3DS or something like that, and I didn't really get very far. But you had mentioned that one of the things that Zelda, like the Zelda franchise, does to kind of avoid that is that they make fairly large changes every once in a while. Things like Breath of the Wild to kind of bring new, fresh ideas into the franchise. And it sounded like from what you said, you think that's how they're able to kind of avoid some of that fatigue that comes with, I'm Master Chief, and this is my 70th adventure. Join me, hero, and do the exact same thing that you've been doing for the last 70 years. This is the biggest one yet. Yeah, I'm sorry to shit on Halo, but like I just think it's the biggest example of something being so monolithic and then kind of turning into a whimpering puppy in the corner.
Yeah, a little bit. So Zelda has a couple of advantages in this space, which is that they don't adhere to a single art style. They don't adhere to a single storyline. I have a copy of the Hyrule Historia sitting just out of arm's reach. I actually meant to grab that before we started the recording. Oopsie poopsie. But if you look at the timeline, that timeline was not. It's like if the Star Wars sequels were a success. No one writes this shit ahead of time. It's just in there. It's just happening. Because there are timelines where like Link dies and Ganon wins, and that's where you get all the Hyrule is flooded, and that's Wind Waker, and so that level of obscurity, which is not really a word, but is good enough for me. Obfuscation, I think, would be the thing, but it works to the benefit of not having a codified character. Like, the first Halo game was Master Chief's biggest challenge yet. And then the second game was his second biggest challenge yet. And then the third one was this. And then the fourth one was that. And then the fifth one was the Fall from Grace. And then the sixth one was whatever. It becomes less interesting. Whereas if you can kind of play with these timelines in this fantasy realm, you gain a level of flexibility where you can kind of change things around in that situation. And making a sequel in that space, in my opinion, is a lot like making a sequel in a Mario game. Mario never addresses the number of pipes he's dropped down, the number of Goombas he's stomped on, the number of art styles he's shifted, the number of galaxies he's been to. You make a sequel to Mario, all you have in your quiver is one arrow labeled creativity, and then you go, and it shoots. And so long as you have talented level designers, the narrative doesn't really matter nearly as much as the experience. And so when you have an experience-based, it's why it's different making a sequel to a game like God of War. Let's say God of War again. God of War, you need to, even in the early ones, you need to maintain Kratos' character, but not change it too much until there's a 5 or 6 year gap. And then you can change his character, and at which point you can be retrospective and introspective and, poetic.
Well, it worked so well there, too, for 2018's God of War.
Oh, it absolutely did.
It was such a long break. And also, they completely redid the genre of the game. I mean,
exactly.
It went from, a game that I would never touch because I just don't really like beat 'em up kind of like...
Yeah, it's a fixed camera hack and slash.
Yeah. Sorry, that's the hack and slash. Sorry. Yeah. I would never play it in its original form. I would just watch the cinematics.
Yeah, no, I mean, and they're gory and entertaining and like deliciously excessive in a certain way. But that's okay. So you've got this character, you've given him emotional depth. Link has none of that, so you can do whatever you want with Link. Is he on an island trying to wake up the big dream whale this time? Cool. Is he just walking around? No, it's always been about gameplay for Zelda. So the story of it is something that people have kind of mapped together piecemeal to make sense of what seems like a hugely large world. And I think that's a brilliant way to make sequels. For games specifically, it would be much harder in film or television or any particular thing. Also, if you can hear scratching noises in the background, that is my cat desperately trying to come in here. But I will not open the door for him.
Well, to your point, I think the interesting thing, and this is like kind of a weird Nintendo leg up, is they really rely on the multiverse to a degree that I think like no one really sees at face value. I mean, I know I mentioned to you like Pokemon, like technically like Pokemon canonically, every single game is like its own little like universe that all coexist but don't exist in the same timeline. Like that's been, I think it was like X and Y that really got into that a lot. It's a similar thing with like Zelda that's neat because it gives people this like thing that they like I feel like people really like a consistent like narrative, a consistent lore, right? It gives them that, but it also doesn't make the overall experience suffer by tying them all so close together that they need to be part of the same continuity. And so I think that's what really weakens things like Halo, and even like I don't think Gears of War 5 and 4 are that bad. I think that largely they're new enough and the new characters are cool enough that they like bring you in, but they still suffer from largely being a part of like the same main group of characters, i.e. the Skywalker saga kind of thing. Of,
yeah,
like,
I was
them
literally
not
about to
wanting
say
leave.
Star Wars.
Yeah, it's like you. I think you can. I think you can like. There, God of War was successful because it made so many changes. Like it thematically was a different game, but it still followed the same character.
Yeah,
but that's the only reason it did well. I think.
How many different links are there?
However, actually, that wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be however many different games.
No, there are a couple of different ones, but there are a bunch of different links.
Well, it's because they all have their own little stories.
He is the hero of time. He is a vessel. He never speaks, except if you're looking at the Zelda CDI games, which are amazing, and you should definitely go buy a CDI and play them. You'll love them. If you love hating things, they suck. But the the entire idea there is that we've taken the hero's journey, we've distilled it down to, here is the boy. The boy can travel time. He's the hero of time. Is it a reincarnation? We'll never explain that. Is it the same guy? We can explain that with a bifurcated timeline. Does he ever speak? Does he have a consistent costume? Not anymore. No, he doesn't. It's just this pure open room where you can create things in your own mind. And I think that is the power of narratively making a sequel past a certain number of games.
Well, he's the link between all the games.
Yes, he is the link between all the games. But to move past Zelda a little bit, because Zelda, I mean, actually, before I move past Zelda, I might as well mention one of the more interesting correlations that I've kind of found is that this game, Tears of the Kingdom specifically, is essentially the Majora's Mask. It is Majora's Mask as to Ocarina in that sense. Ocarina was notably and famously a rush development cycle game, where they're like, okay, well, we need to get another one out really quickly. That was probably not the case with Tears of the Kingdom, as evidenced by the time difference. But the idea there was, we'll fundamentally change some of the mechanics, but keep the map. We don't have to remodel everything. We don't have to, we'll build a couple of dungeons. So we'll get the dungeon building team over on this one, and we'll get them over on this one. And it is some people's favorite Zelda game, including one notable future guest on the show, who shall remain nameless. But this game feels very much like that in a sense, where it's like, okay, we're going to recycle just a couple of elements, but let you interact with them in a very different way. In Majora's Mask, it was the 3-day death loop and the focus on time of day. In this one, it's all of your different abilities. You can completely modify almost every object that has physics on it in some wild ways. And it's also a little bit darker. The color scheme is a little bit more ominous, and it makes for a fascinating sort of direct sequel, because in Zelda games, direct sequels aren't really very common. Same with Mario. Direct sequels aren't very common.
Have there been any in Mario? There probably have been. I just don't pay attention to the story.
I actually don't. Well, there's no story in Mario. It's the same story every time, more or less.
Yeah, Mario Baseball is the same story as Super.
Okay, well, we're talking about spin-offs now, not sequels. But outside of that one, like, okay, Mario 1, Mario 2, Mario 3, blah, blah, blah. Mario Galaxy 26. And Mario Galaxy 2, they're not necessarily direct sequels. They have similar characters, they have returning characters, they have evolved mechanics. And it's this idea of what brings freshness to a winning concept, because for every kind of rotten thing that Nintendo does, they have winning concepts, and by and large their mechanics just work and feel good.
Yeah.
And their games usually release very polished. And Tears of the Kingdom is a really good example of that. Outside of Zelda, though, to kind of move past that, I know you mentioned Halo and Gears of War. Do you have any other examples of like poor evolution in terms of like sequel development, Zach?
Well, the one thing I wanted to mention before going into some bad examples was just kind of, I think, like something that shares a lot of DNA with Zelda, at least in the way that they handle sequels, which is Final Fantasy. And I want to clarify that I don't necessarily think that, although Final Fantasy has started to change the way that the games actually play from, a traditional like turn-based RPG.
Turn-based, yeah.
But I more mean it in the sense that like Final Fantasy, I don't think all of the games are in separate universes. I do think occasionally some of them are direct sequels, but for the most part, They're all games that are linked together by like thematically similar elements and thematically similar styles of, gameplay. And they stay relevant and they stay interesting. One, because the graphics continually like keep getting better, but like also it's not the same story, it's not the same characters. There's things like Bahamut, there's things like oh gosh, the Dragoon, there's these thematic thing, the Chocobo, all these different things that are like in a lot of the games, but largely they're not direct sequels of one another. So I see a lot of similarities there between Zelda and Final Fantasy in terms of how like narratively
I would agree
they kind of link up. To your initial question though, I think probably the most close to my heart example of sequels that I think are casually getting worse is anything that Bethesda makes. And then What do I mean by that? Well, and I'll even crap on Oblivion, which is my favorite like open world RPG game. I think Oblivion is a dumbed down version of Morrowind. I think they made Oblivion more accessible for people in order to get a bigger mass appeal, and they went away from the RPG roots that were in Morrowind. Now, that being said, I don't think all the changes were bad. Like, the roll to hit thing felt horrible in Morrowind. I'm sure some people liked it, but I didn't, so I'm not upset about that. But I think when you go from, like, Oblivion to Skyrim, you see the same thing. They get rid of, like, the custom spells that you can make. All of these custom potions you can make in Oblivion, those aren't in Skyrim. They like dumb down a bunch of the other systems. And so I think that the next Elder Scrolls game will be even more streamlined and even more dumbed down than Skyrim. I know within the communities, there's kind of like a joke that whatever Elder Scrolls game you start on is your favorite one. And that's certainly the case for me. I feel like this is also the case though with Fallout. Like, I think Fallout 4 is a more RPG focused game than Fallout 3. That's what I meant to say. Fallout 3 is a more RPG focused game than Fallout 4. And there is the weird thing of New Vegas, but technically that was Obsidian and not Bethesda.
Yeah, it was Obsidian, yeah. And there is an argument that Obsidian makes better Fallout games.
I would agree. I would agree with that. I think they understand more what I'm looking for from like an RPG kind of game.
I think Outer Worlds kind of proves that.
And Outer Worlds like was a pretty short game, and I still loved it for what it was.
It was great.
I'm excited for 2. And talking about a sequel, I think 2 will be great because I think Outer Worlds 2 will just be more of Outer Worlds 1. It might look a little bit better, but it's largely probably just going to like, now that they basically, did the proof of concept with the first game, they get to come out with the second one. And there's less risk there, so they're going to get more money. But anyway, that would be my answer to your question, would be Bethesda or like the Fable franchise. I think the Fable franchise kind of famously kept over-promising with each of the sequels and like drastically under-delivering. But I feel like largely the issue with them were they were really short. They weren't very long. They weren't like a satisfying length. And then they under-delivered on what they kept like hyping up. But that's just Peter Molyneux, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, that's the man. No, I would completely agree, and I would actually go so far as to say that for me, my Bethesda is BioWare, where I've played through Dragon Age 1, 2, and Inquisition completely, and the actual RPG, you had the roll dice to hit sort of Dungeons and Dragons mentality in the first one and the second one, and then it was largely absent. So there's this kind of streamlining and focusing of game design in sequels in those that really does limit some of your personalities. Now here's the conflicted one, and it's Mass Effect. The first Mass Effect game I still love. I hate the Mako. Hashtag hate the Mako. And the second one is everyone's favorite.
Yeah.
It's a really good game.
I love too.
It took all of the ideas of the first one and the storyline. If we're talking about, issues between narrative and gameplay, it took the first one and it streamlined the gameplay, but it also streamlined some of the RPG aspects. And then by the third one, EA's nasty fingers had been all up in there, and it streamlined everything so much that even though I actually, okay, hot take, I still love Mass Effect 3. I think Mass Effect 3 is really good. Say what you want about the ending.
Well, I think that's why most people don't like Mass Effect 3 is the ending. I don't know that there's a ton of people that dislike it for the minute-to-minute gameplay. At least in my circles.
Yeah, it's really good. I think they might have changed engines somewhere in between the two, because all the characters look slightly different in a way that's weirdly Uncanny Valley-esque. But you know, I think those games work, but there is that streamlining quality where the number of choices you get to make, the way you get to make those choices, the consequences of those choices. And I understand that that's compounded by the fact that the game that came out in, when did Mass Effect 1 come out? 07 or 03?
It was not 03.
I want to say it was 03.
I don't think it was. That sounds way too early. 03 is like Warcraft. Or, sorry, WoW came out in 03.
Then it was probably 07.
I mean, I'll look it up. Mass Effect release.
Original release.
07, yeah.
07, okay. No-scoped it. And then waffled, so negating the no-scope.
2 came out 3 years later, which is kind of crazy. That's a pretty quick
time. But like, that game was baked out of BioWare's experience with, like, Knights of the Old Republic. And, you know, you can feel that difference when you shift more from RPG to action. But the narrative was just as strong. The final boss fight sucked. But the characters were really interesting, and the way you got to interact with them was interesting, and it worked. Mass Effect 3, slightly anticlimactic conclusion in its original version, but ultimately, in my opinion, a good game, but also much more action-focused. You had more abilities, you had more of this, you had more of that. It was a lot of the Call of Duty effect, which I know is Activision, not EA, but it's, you know, that idea in there.
Well, to your point, I think that I think Mass Effect found that what people really liked was the character-driven stuff, and they improved on that. I mean, from what I've seen with 3, I've actually never played 3, but from what I've seen with 3, yeah, I played Andromeda. I didn't play 3.
Oh God, why?
I actually didn't hate Andromeda as much as people want you to hate Andromeda.
I did play Andromeda, and I don't hate Andromeda. I just don't.
Andromeda just wasn't polished. I don't think it was a bad game. The problem is
that we're about to start a whole other episode here. The problem is not that it wasn't polished. The problem is that it wasn't a Mass Effect game, really. It was Dragon Age Inquisition. It was made in the Frostbite engine, and let's take the jank out of it. They did not have the breadth of lore, the breadth of... I mean, like, just take the first 3 hours of the first Mass Effect game, and this is relevant. Take the first hours of the first Mass Effect game and see, like, okay, so you're learning about the Volus, you're learning about the Elcor, you're learning about the Hanar, you're learning about the Asari, you're learning about all of these different things that are all going to be relevant as things come. And then they all have their own interpolitical sort of relationships. And that comes to fruition in number 3. In number 4, it's like, there's bad guy, there's bad robot.
Well, you can argue some of that for sure, but
that's
I feel
a bad
like
sequel.
I feel like, though, to a degree, isn't that just changing the game? Because like, right, like, I mean, Gears of War, sorry. Although Gears of War Judgment is a horrendous game and by far one of the worst sequels I've ever played in my life, or spinoffs or whatever you want to call it. But isn't God of War 2018 then not a God of War game? because it doesn't function the same way as the old God of War games. I mean, I know I get a little bit what you're saying. You're saying that you don't think they deliver on some of the storytelling and lore in Andromeda as well. But like, I just mean like the initial way you framed it was like, it's not a Mass Effect game. But we just talked about earlier that if you change franchise or like change, you know, you make a big enough of a change, it can be a way to actually kind of embolden your game, you know,
yes,
strengthen it.
Exactly. The difference there, and that's actually a really good point, because God of War 2018 is
a much better game than Andromeda. To clarify it,
it's a better game than Andromeda, absolutely. Okay. But it's, in my opinion, it's a masterpiece. It completely changed art direction. It completely changed style. It completely changed combat mechanics. It's one of the best games maybe I've ever played. And I mostly liked the original God of War games. Changing style, changing everything, changing all that stuff, that's fine. What you maintain is dependent on what you change. So God of War changed everything mechanically and took a microscope and looked at what they'd done narratively in the previous games and said, how can we tell a deep, touching, personal story? And they did that, and they executed on the mechanic change. They executed on the narrative change. They executed on the design for the world change. It was fantastic. Mass Effect Andromeda made a better Mako. I'll give them that. But they gave you a not interesting main character. Not that Shepard was that compelling to begin with.
Yeah.
But regardless of which gender you chose for your Shepard was not a particularly compelling character. He was more of a vessel, much like Link.
For your soul, yeah.
For your soul vessels. It was more that, like, it was an empty Ubisoft world. And what made those original games special, and what you could have implemented into a modernized version of Mass Effect, was that deep lore and multiple alien races. And they just didn't do that. Within the first 3 hours of the first Mass Effect, you meet like 16 different alien races, and they all have their own interpersonal conflicts. There's like 3.
So it sounds,
and that's the compelling part of Mass Effect for me. Is the reason I like Mass Effect is I got to undo the Krogan genophage.
Yeah.
You know, I got to undo that. That's great, because I was working with a Solarian who initially helped start the whole thing. And then, you know, I got to help the Geth and the that's not Canary. Whoever Tali is, her alien species, you know, get back to their home planet and make peace. As you can tell, I ran the Paragon route. And I think that's the most compelling thing about Quarian. Yeah. She was a Quarian. That's the most compelling thing about Mass Effect, is all of those intermixed things. That to me is as core to Mass Effect as the character of Kratos is to God of War. You can reframe it, but if you just strip it away and it's like, okay, bad alien, nasty robots, good alien, it becomes a lot less interesting. That is an example for me of a bad sequel.
Well, so I mean, it just sounds like, yeah, you don't feel that they. Well, I mean, I think a lot of people would argue they don't really execute on the gameplay, the minute-to-minute or moment-to-moment gameplay.
I would actually argue the opposite.
So you think they do execute on the moment-to-moment gameplay? You just don't think they distilled down what Mass Effect was?
Yeah, very much in the vein
and what people
of,
like. Okay,
yeah,
no,
very much in the vein
that makes sense.
Very much in the vein of you know, Fallout or Elder Scrolls.
I mean, what I'll say on the BioWare side, skipping the, I love Dragon Age. Dragon Age 1 is probably one of my favorite games. I think
it's exceptional.
Yeah, Dragon Age 1, for anyone that hasn't played it, because at this point it's an old game, air quotes, which feels gross to say. It's amazing. I absolutely love it. The storytelling in it is amazing. Everything about it is absolutely amazing. But Inquisition is certainly a departure from the original game, and it's for a lot of the same reasons we've mentioned, I think, in terms of.
But I liked Inquisition.
I don't think Inquisition's bad. I have trouble beating it because I get bored midway through it.
No, it's boring and it's repetitive.
I like Inquisition, but it's boring.
No, I like Inquisition. I enjoyed Inquisition a great deal, but it is a part of that streamlining effect where you're like, okay, we need more action. It can't just be turn-based. It can't be, this, that, and the other thing. It's a fairly common design thing. I think I interrupted you though. And
no. I mean,
closer.
I think we're on a similar page. I mean, Inquisition's not a bad game by any measure. But it's a similar issue to like when I kind of brought up with like Bethesda, which is me really liking some of these more, I'm going to say unrefined RPG elements. And what I mean by unrefined is they're closer to kind of like D&D. They're kind of closer to their original state. Yeah. Not unrefined in the sense that they're poorly implemented, but I think that there's a lot more of that in some of these original like BioWare, Bethesda games and whatnot. And I feel like everything's just getting streamlined so that it has the most mass appeal. And obviously like that can lead to positive sequels. Like we've talked a lot about God of War here. And I think that ultimately the move to make God of War more of a narrative driven sort of RPG, not exactly open world, but like quasi open world experience. I think that's more appealing to a wider audience than what the original God of Wars are. But I just think you have to be careful when you're making those changes. Sorry, what did you say?
I said wider audience is the thing.
Yeah, but I don't think necessarily, and I know you don't think this, it's a weird dance of like getting a wider audience, because obviously if you've got a really niche game, you're not going to be air quotes successful. But also it kind of depends on like what is success, but we'll talk about it in the AAA sense, which means big dollar. So if you want to make big dollar, obviously, you're going to try and like focus on getting more players. But at the same time, you can't change it so much that like you burn your original player base, which are the ones that are going to hype up your game. Like,
oh, yeah, totally. Well, I mean, so I guess that's actually a decent segue into, like, successful sequels. So we've already talked about God of War. I would argue that at least Mass Effect 2... I mean, I would also argue Mass Effect 3, but that's a contentious opinion. Are, successful sequels. I would call Breath of the Wild a successful evolution because it is a direct sequel, but it's also not trying to do what Breath of the Wild did before Breath of the Wild came out, if that makes any sense. The idea with Breath of the Wild was we're going to fundamentally change the formula. And just toss linear progression out the door. And Tears of the Kingdom maintains the exact same structure. That's fine for me because there's an evolution there. I would say Assassin's Creed 2, actually, is a good example of something slightly similar, where it's like, okay, we'll keep most of the same mechanics, and then run with a couple of other different bits that will kind of richen the world. I would call that a successful sequel. The Last of Us Part 2 had its...
Hey, be careful what you're about to say, Aaron.
No, careful. I was going to say, it had its work cut out for it. Because how do you follow up The Last of Us Part 1? It's a narrative masterpiece for video games, I would say. And it decided to narratively and mechanically challenge you in ways that you would not have expected were there not numerous leaks beforehand. I would say Mario games are a good example of this. It's evolution in mechanics, not storyline. You know, what else can we add?
Mario Strikers 2 is not a good game, I'm sorry to tell you. I would also argue that the Mario Kart games
Mario games, and you knew that. I've also not played Mario Strikers 2.
It's not, in my opinion, a good evolution of it. And like I said, I also think Mario Kart has gone downhill since Double Dash. But you know.
Double Dash is my favorite Mario Kart game. Just to be
perfect.
Honest,
it's perfection.
It's so good.
It's infallible.
Mario Kart 8 is really good though. But like there are ways to take core ideas and either subvert your expectations in a way that Rian Johnson would never understand, or take your mechanics and say, let's just shift them a little bit. Like 10 degrees this way, 10 degrees this way, 10 degrees this way. What's the weirdest thing we can do? Well, we'll give you a mechanic that lets you surf through a weird portal all the way up through any ceiling within range. Okay.
It's a good mechanic.
Sure. If you can make that work, it's great. If you can make that work, then that's fantastic. Narratively, though, The Last of Us Part 2 was doing this crazy subversion thing. And, you know, it's the reason we don't have a Skitchin 2, because where are you going to go with Skitchin?
What I kind of feel like as we're talking through a lot of this is that I think when you've got a trilogy, the second game is so often my favorite, I feel like. Because I feel like, so Gears of War 2, as an example. First game's good, but it is kind of clunkier. It's not distilled to greatness yet. Then you get...
I would say refined.
Or refined to greatness yet. And then you get Gears of War 2, which I don't think you've played, but... Mm-hmm. Like, is great. I mean, it's everything that's good about the first game, but just more refined. You return to these characters that you like. And I mean this more broadly. I think that's one of the really cool things about, like, the number twos in a lot of trilogies is, like, you return to the characters that you like. There's something kind of, like, heartwarming. It's like a homecoming because it's the first time you've returned to those characters. And anyway, yeah, Gears of War 2, really, really, really solid game that I like quite a bit. I'm trying to think of some other sequels to things that aren't just like Battlefield. Bad Company 2 is great. Battlefield Bad Company 2 is fantastic.
Bad Company 2 is very good.
And technically a direct sequel.
Well, while you try and come up with other ones, I'll vamp for a second and say that my favorite example of this is actually Empire Strikes Back, which is my favorite Star Wars movie. It took everything that the first one did well, amped it up just enough, and added internal conflict to a character you already knew. Brilliant narrative construction. Absolutely immaculate in terms of escalating things for a sequel, but not overdoing it. And I think that's like the gold standard for sequels. You know, most sequels think that they need to... I mean, sequels don't think, but most people making sequels think that they need to take it up a notch. Okay, John Wick was really good. What is John Wick 2 going to be? Well, it's going to be John Wick punching, kicking, flipping, and doing things. And let's just take that to 11. Yeah, it's fine, but it wasn't as good as John Wick.
I think, honestly, with some of the stuff, it runs into an issue of... Well, I can tell you for like exactly what John Wick runs into an issue of. John Wick runs into the issue of, like, from a narrative perspective, it's like, okay, we're going to fight a mafia boss. Cool. Okay, that's relatively local, whatever. Then it like scales up, and I can't remember who the enemy of the second one is, and then it scales up again. Like John Wick's issue, and this is the issue of some other games or movies as well, is they keep upping the ante. It's like the same issue with like Marvel movies. It's like once you fight someone that's basically a god who can snap and wipe out half the universe, like what even is a bigger threat than that? Like
exactly.
Yeah.
And now distill that down as if a teardrop was coming out of a tower onto your Sheikah slate, distill that down and just say, we're upping the ante. Upping the ante just isn't enough in a sequel. That's my kind of take on it, is that upping the ante isn't enough. It needs to be refined. It needs to be honed.
Well,
it needs to be more effectively communicated, or it needs to be completely different. That's why I like anthologies, which is more or less what a lot of the Zelda games are, is they're anthologies. It's ideas that pour into a pre-existing world, and you can just do whatever you want in there.
Yeah, and that's, when you have a more episodic approach to your games, like we were talking about before, I think you're not shackled to what's happened previously, which I think can be super helpful. Imagine if the last Star Wars movie in the sequel trilogy wasn't shackled to the wonderful middle entry. But on a serious note, I do think another issue with like a lot of what we're talking about now when we're talking about upping the ante, I feel like that mostly applies to narrative. Obviously, it could also apply to some mechanics, but I think what happens a lot with both games and film when you're talking about sequels is like the middle movie in a trilogy hypes itself up too much, and so it makes the third one just like not hit the same that it should. I don't know. That's what I kind of run into a lot. I feel like is there's too much of an escalation. Whereas what you were kind of, I think, saying earlier is like you kind of want a bit of an escalation, but not so much that when you get to like your final, movie, game, whatever you're doing seems trivial, in comparison or the same. I think also just random like note, if you think about it, and we've talked about this, I know you've talked about this, but the other thing that games have that they run into that's a little bit different than movies that's difficult is like a game. You mentioned Breath of the Wild, right? That's like an 100-hour experience for you. Once you beat Tears of a Kingdom, that'll probably be another roughly 100-hour experience for you. If they come out with a third game, you've got like over 200 hours in this world. Like, that's not the same as a movie. So familiarity with something is going to be way different in those two situations, I feel like, as well. Because, like, what? A movie's going to be either like 2 hours, 30 minutes on average or something?
Something like that. Yeah, but I mean, like, it could be, probably a little bit lower, depending on how much more directors want to make movies be fucking 3 hours and 18 minutes. But yeah, I mean, doing the exact same experience multiple times is not interesting that much. You have to change the way that you interact with the world, because you don't get to interact with the world in a film. Avatar 2, I did not get to interact with it. It was 3 hours of my life that I just kind of spent watching a story. Technologically fantastic. Experientially, could have been an hour and a half shorter.
I just, the movie has the morality of like a 5-year-old. Like it's so surface level. Sorry, I just had to say that.
It's no, you're completely right. No, you're completely right. I could do an entire episode.
I mean, the first movie was Fern Gully, so.
The first movie was Fern Gully meets The Matrix. It's fine. It's fine. The problem is that they shoot straight down the middle every time in terms of narrative. Yeah. That's the only issue. Outside of that, with games, I can't, like, I want to hold a controller in my hand right now and try and describe, like, what it feels like to play a game, and then to play something that feels like the same game, but slightly different. I'll never forget the minute that the targeting mechanic and the deflect bits were changed in Assassin's Creed 2, and thinking the first time, oh, fuck this. I can't do this. This is out of my ken. And then 2 minutes later, I was like, oh, this is amazing. It's the learning curve.
Yeah.
but you don't have to learn when you watch a movie necessarily, but because you're not interacting with it in a tactile way. When you do it with a game, you do have to drive people towards tactile learning. And you have to change the physical experience of interacting with things, because if you don't interact with a game, then it's just a disc or a cartridge or a download file sitting on your hard drive and $70 out of your pocket. So there are a million good sequels that have taken this well, and there's a million different ways you can flip mechanics. Zelda is actually probably the best example of flipping mechanics. And not just because of Z targeting or everything, but you can do almost anything to change the way that someone interacts with the thing you made, sequel to sequel.
Mm-hmm.
And that's almost impossible. I would say Breath of the Wild flipped it very well. I would say Tears of the Kingdom evolved it very well. I would say that Fable, for example, did not do it super well in terms of evolving. I'd say Mario has done it extremely well. Same controller, same this, same that. It's just almost an impossible puzzle to solve, and it's all very subjective, but there's no substitute for good ideas, and there shouldn't be any constraints on good ideas so long as they're actually good.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'd agree that, like, I think there probably, I don't know if there's a science, but I definitely think that there's things you can do and best practices you can make when you're trying to come out with a sequel. I mean, hell, at like a very base level, you could do I'm going to wait 10 years and then remaster this game that everyone loved at the time, and then it's going to sell really well. I guess technically that's not a sequel, but like you could air quotes call it a sequel, and people haven't like played that kind of content for so long that like they'll buy it and probably think it's great. But yeah. No, I mean, it's just interesting in a world of, especially now, I had alluded earlier, and I'll kind of say this as a bit of a wrapping up comment, but I was at a game conference, and I was listening to some VCs, venture capital, for those that don't know, companies and publishers talk about, what are they investing in, da-da-da-da-da. And right now we're in a bit of a economic downturn. So a lot of publishers and VCs and whatnot are not really interested in new IPs. They're very interested in kind of cross promotional IPs with like traditional entertainment, i.e. film, television. And what that illustrates to me is like a lot of people are looking to do sequels or tie-ins to things and da-di-da-di-da. So, it's like a lower risk thing. People feel like it's a better commitment to get their money back. And when you're in that kind of world, it's just going to be interesting to see like what's the majority of the content that comes out, whether it be sequels or it be like game versions of different IPs that don't exist as games already. Like, I don't know, it'll be interesting. Obviously, that's not just talking about sequels, but I feel like that makes a landscape for sequels to be a safer bet for a lot of people throwing money into games.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, the resurgence of remakes, spin-offs, famously I want to say it was Bayonetta spin-off, that maybe it wasn't Bayonetta. It might have been Bayonetta.
I think Bayonetta did just have a spin-off, but it's fairly recent.
Yeah, and that's the one that's supposed to save Japan from a crisis where people aren't having enough children.
Oh, is that the plot of that game?
No, that was what one of their public officials had said.
Oh, their former prime minister. Yeah, who gets memed on. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, I'm like, but also I'm tired of sequels. I'm tired of spin-offs. I'm like, just make something new. I know it's easier to do it this way, but stop. Just like, I will be 100% honest, and this will be my closing salvo. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is the most exhausting prospect to me. I will see the film, but just stop.
Aaron's going to see the movie and love it, is what's going to happen. And he's going to be like, on this one episode, I said it was exhaustive. And man, was I wrong. This is my favorite movie.
Happen. It will make for a great sound clip. But I'm just like, just make something new. Indiana Jones. Here's the final thing for me in terms of sequels, spin-offs, reboots, and whatnot. And then we will probably proceed to our outros because we are over time. There's a cascading effect where these early films influenced a generation of filmmakers who saw that and said, I can do that, but me style. And you got your Spielbergs, you got your George Lucas's, you've got a bunch of other huge popular filmmakers who've done stuff like that. And the cascade effect means, in this sense, that the newer generation of filmmakers aren't getting the opportunity necessarily to make large budget, hugely successful films or games that are just building off of something that inspired them, which I think is admirable. They're building off of something that was inspired by someone who 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 was inspired by someone. And more frequently, we're getting them being inspired by the sequel to the sequel to the prequel 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 to the reboot to the prequel to the sequel.
I thought you were going to just say they weren't inspired to begin with, because there's a lot of that too. People who aren't inspired, they're just paid.
Oh yeah, that's definitely a thing. But like, I'm not here to crap on anybody, but if you just keep rebooting things or making sequels to pre-existing things, unless you have a good idea, change your direction, make something new. And that's where sequel as an actual word becomes, kind of sticky, because is Breath of the Wild a sequel to Skyward Sword? I don't think it is. Maybe technically, someone will draw out a map. I'm sure you can find that on YouTube. Where does it fall on the timeline? But they're saying, okay, we've got this. Let's make something different. And then Tears of the Kingdom comes out, and it's the Breath of the Wild world that you knew now changed. And the way that you interact with everything is completely different. And I think that's the way to approach sequels, if possible. Because the rest of it is just exhausting. Anyway, that's it. Can I take off my arm sleeve now?
Yes. No, I mean, you could have taken that off a long time ago and just said you were wearing
man,
it.
I thought that was in my contract.
No. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get that into your contract.
Sleeve's coming off. I'm no longer Link.
Well, everyone, hopefully you've enjoyed our long conversation on sequels. We just kind of wanted to talk about it since there was a solid opportunity with Zelda Tears of a Kingdom coming out. Ultimately, like I said, I do think there are some best practices. If you want to comment some of your favorite sequels or least favorite sequels, or whatever you want to comment, feel free to do that. I'm sure it'll give us a good chuckle, especially if you make some kind of joke out of it. We appreciate you tuning in and listening. But before we do our official goodbye, I do want to say quick thank you to eDougie Art. And of course, all of you already know this, but I just have to say it contractually, or else she will beat me with a large stick that has a rock on it.
Another stick attached to it.
Yeah, it has another stick attached to it, seemingly with glue that's green. I'm not really sure. It might be boogers. I don't really know. It comes out of my hand. This is weird Zelda jokes that aren't funny for those that were curious. But anyway, no, Eduggy art is fantastic. She helped us with our art, and we definitely appreciate her. You can find her on Etsy and on Instagram under the tag @eduggyart.
Yes, indeed. Always worth a check, as is naturally Beach Girl. Beach Girl provided our fantastic intro and outro music. And they have a bunch of other stuff that doesn't sound anything like the sort of stuff that you've heard at the beginning of this episode and will soon hear. You can find them on Spotify, Bandcamp, SoundCloud, anything on the internet that provides good digital music. And Spotify would be your last bet, I would say, just because the other ones give you the opportunity to give them a little bit of money for all their hard work. So long as you enjoy the music, feel free to support them on any of those other platforms. Outside of that, I think we are good, but do look at Beach Girl.
Yeah, so outside of that, thanks everybody for tuning in. Like I said, hopefully you liked our conversation here, talking about sequels, what can make them good, what can make them bad, some of our favorite ones, some of our least favorite ones. As always,
Assassin's Creed Unity.
Okay. As always, I'm one of your hosts, Zach.
And I'm your other host, Aaron.
And remember, everybody, that if your name is Gary Bowser, Nintendo might send you to prison for 40 months. All right. Have a good weekend. Bye. Or whatever time. I don't know.
The entire idea there is that we've taken the hero's journey, we've distilled it down to, here is the boy.